So this is actually a study in contrast in probably more ways than the organizers intended, because David is an academic who's become a mixographer, and I'm a high school dropout who's become a professor of American institutions and international diplomacy. But in my brief, if David's brief was to talk about himself, my brief is to talk about my book, which is a little tricky to do in such a short time. It's a very long book, and the reason it's such a long book is because everybody who writes about Russia as a journalist at some point has to write the Russia book to end all Russia books. So one of those comes out every couple of years. I wrote one this year. It was my turn. It's called The Future is History, How Totalitarianism Reclaimed Russia. And it was actually a book about, I had, as Robin mentioned, I was born in Moscow. I came here for the first time with my parents. I immigrated here for the first time, that is, with my parents when I was 14. And then I went back as a correspondent in the early 90s and stayed for more than 20 years. And then had to leave again, rather in a hurry. And so I really wanted to write a book that, for me, also ended sort of my Russia story. It was a sad project. It was a book about what didn't happen, right? What didn't happen was what I went there to cover in the early 90s, which was how Russia was going to become a democracy, how Russia was going to be free, how it was going to just be this breathtaking, beautiful story. And it was for a while. It was absolutely breathtaking. It was the journalism experience of many lifetimes, I think. But I wanted to figure out what didn't happen. And I think that part of what I realized as I was writing it and as I was researching it was just sort of how that idea that Russia was going to be this free democratic country was constructed. It was constructed like if you imagine a person who's been abused, or say, a woman who's been human trafficked, who is rescued, and her abuser is put in jail, and so then somebody tells her, go, have a good life. Go have healthy, happy relationships. Well, it's not terribly likely that that's going to happen unless she has a lot of help and a lot of treatment, and that's called trauma. And it's not like trauma, the idea of trauma has never been applied to countries or societies. Actually, trauma psychology began with that, with the study of groups. But we don't usually talk about countries that way. And certainly the assumption both, and I was, at the time this was happening, I was both sort of a Western journalist writing about Russia in English, but also a Moscow intellectual thinking about Russia in Russian. And both of those groups thought, oh, well, now it's all going to happen for us, without thinking that the country, the society was very much like a person who'd been abused. And so it ended up being a book about trauma, about how trauma works in societies, and I tried to write it through people. But the other thing that the book ended up being about was uncertainty. Right? What makes people actually, again, sort of going back to this analogy of trauma, we know, right, that an individual who doesn't get the help, or even many individuals, unfortunately, who do get the help, who've been abused, will recreate the situation of abuse, right? So what makes a society create the situation of abuse, or recreate the situation of abuse? So I went back to reading the early thinkers, the original thinkers about totalitarianism, and the book that really, and I knew I was going to use Hannah Arendt a lot, and that's very much in the book. But the book that really sort of blew my mind was a book that many people who went to college read in college, but as I mentioned, I didn't. So I read Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom, which is an amazing book. If you haven't read it, go read it. If you read it in college, go read it again. It's a very slim book, unlike The Origins of Totalitarianism. You can read it in the evening. Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst and a social psychologist And he writes, one of the most poignant things to me about the book is the introduction, where he apologizes for the book being a little rough and sort of hastily written. And he says, well, I feel like the world is on the verge of catastrophe, so I needed to write it really fast. And he's writing this in 1940. And he's a German psychoanalyst in exile at this point. He ended up writing amazing stuff when he was an American psychoanalyst about a thing called malignant narcissism, which is a concept very much coming back into vogue among psychologists these days. But what I was looking at a couple of years ago was what he wrote about freedom and attitudes toward freedom. And he had this idea that there are two kinds of freedom. There's freedom from that we all want, right? Freedom from being told by our parents what to do. Freedom from being restrained and constrained. And there's freedom to invent yourself, freedom to be somebody and that there's times in human history when freedom too is really pronounced, right? Like at the end of feudalism, people were no longer born into a trade, were no longer born into a community in which they were going to live for the rest of their lives. And it was terrifying to have that uncertainty. And so he sort of writes about how Calvinism is one example of the kind of authority that appealed to people for whom the burden of freedom too was just too painfully unbearable. And then he gets to the 1920s and 30s in Europe, and he makes the argument that it's a similar moment in history, when uncertainty is so great and freedom too is so huge that it overwhelms the sense of freedom from, and people just want to hand their autonomy over to somebody. And so they look for someone who will be that authority. So there I am writing this about Russia, thinking, oh, well, that's what happened in the 90s, right? I was among that small group of people for whom freedom from the collapse of the Soviet regime was just so awesomely wonderful. But for most people in Russia, freedom too was overwhelming and painful and burdensome. And so no wonder the country would sort of glom onto Putin, who's a nobody, a mediocrity, and hand over their autonomy to him. So the book is built about around a bunch of characters. These are people who were generous and crazy enough to sit down with me for sometimes as many as 40 hours of interviews and tell me what had been in their heads in their 90s and then going on. And then I spent a year writing the book, including a couple of months when I was writing 4,000 words a day. And then I finished it a little over a year ago, about 13 months ago. So I raised my head from writing it, and I thought, oh, I have just done a whole lot of relevant research. To the point where there are actually people in the book. There's one person in the book named Alexander Dugin, who is a philosopher and thought of very much as a sort of Putin whisperer, who is influenced by the same obscure philosophers as Steve Bannon. And at the same time that I was writing this book, Jesse Green was writing his terrific book about Steve Bannon, and sort of tracking those influences. Who knew? So that brings me actually to a night that we're all about to celebrate the first anniversary of, the worst election night party of our lives, which someone has to create an anthology of memoirs of the worst election night party of our lives. But I was actually on standby for the New York Times that night. I was supposed to write, there were a whole bunch of people in different places who were supposed to write reaction stories about how countries were reacting to Hillary Clinton's election. And at around 1:30 in the morning, I wrote to the editor on duty, who was not my regular editor because everybody had gone home because the New York Times had put together its package on Hillary's election. And I wrote to him, I think I want to write something else. I think I want to write a piece on surviving autocracy. And the reason, one of the reasons that I wanted to write it was because by that time I had started getting panicked letters from friends saying, what do we do now? Like, I'm an authority on this, right? I had to write to escape a country twice, so I clearly know what to do. But then I started thinking, well, do I have things to tell them? And I do. And so I wrote to this person, I want to write a piece on surviving autocracy, and he wrote back saying, well, maybe we should wait for the final results. And you know, by this time it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I said, I don't think there's a lot of suspense left, but I can make it provisional. And he wrote back saying, I don't think so. And so I ended up writing the piece and sending it to the New York Review of Books, and it broke their website several times over. It was called Autocracy Rules for Survival, which was the weirdest publishing experience of my life. It went up on their website at 5 o'clock in the afternoon as I was getting on my bike to bike home from Queens. And by the time I got home, my smartwatch had been fried. Like, literally, it had overheated from the notifications. And yeah, went berserk and never recovered. And it actually, that piece, Autocracy Rules for Survival, not only did it get like millions and millions of views and reprints and on all sorts of things, but also inspired a book, because my friend Tim Snyder, who's a Yale historian, looked at it and thought, oh, well, I could do that too. I could write something about lessons from history, sort of also a list. And so he offered it to the New York Times, and the New York Times said, no, you're crazy. And then he offered it to the New York Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books was like, we can't handle this piece. It keeps crashing the website. So he wrote it as a little book called On Tyranny, Lessons from the 20th Century. And it's a terrific book. So Tim is also somebody who had done a lot of relevant research by spending his entire life researching the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. Thank you.